I'm 65 years old, and 18 months ago, my doctor sat me down and told me I had a fatty liver. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that puts you in a hospital bed, but the kind that quietly sits there raising your risk of diabetes, heart disease, and a whole list of things nobody wants to hear about at my age. And I want to tell you today about the one carbohydrate that, more than anything else I changed, seemed to turn that around. It isn't a supplement. It isn't something exotic. It's a type of carbohydrate that's been sitting in ordinary foods this whole time, and most people are eating it in exactly the wrong way to get any benefit from it at all. It's called resistant starch, and by the end of this video, I'll show you exactly what it did for my liver and exactly how I eat it every single day without turning my life into some complicated diet plan. Let me back up a little because I think my story is probably familiar to a lot of you watching this. I wasn't overweight in any obvious way. I walked most days. I didn't drink much. And yet there it was on my scan, fat sitting inside my liver where it shouldn't be. My doctor mentioned two things that stuck with me. The first was the fat around my organs, what's called visceral fat, the deep fat packed in around the abdomen rather than the fat you can pinch under the skin. The second was the fat that had built up inside the liver itself. Both of these, she told me, are far more dangerous than ordinary body fat, and both of them are strongly tied to type 2 diabetes and heart disease. That conversation sent me down a rabbit hole of research, and that's where I first came across resistant starch and the studies that were using around 40 grams of it a day to shift both of these exact problems. If you find this video useful, please do give it a like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep going, and I'll keep sharing what I learn as I go through this myself. So let's get into what resistant starch actually is, because the name causes a lot of confusion, and once you understand why, the rest of this makes a lot more sense. Most of the starch in the foods we eat every day, things like white bread, rice, pasta, and regular potatoes, gets broken down very quickly in the small intestine into glucose. That glucose floods into the bloodstream and causes a sharp spike in blood sugar. Resistant starch behaves completely differently. As the name suggests, it resists that quick digestion and passes through the small intestine largely untouched. When it reaches the large intestine, the bacteria that live there treat it as food and ferment it, producing compounds called short-chain fatty acids, the most important of which is one called butyrate. That is the exact same process that happens with ordinary fiber, which is why resistant starch is classified as a fiber rather than a regular starch, even though it starts out looking just like the starch in any potato or bowl of rice. So instead of spiking your blood sugar and feeding fat storage the way refined starch does, resistant starch feeds the bacteria that keep your gut, your metabolism, and as it turns out, your liver, functioning properly. And when I dug into the research behind this, I found it was a lot more solid than I expected for something that sounded at first like another wellness trend. In one clinical trial involving people with fatty liver disease, participants were given either resistant starch or an ordinary starch that looked and tasted almost identical at around 40 grams a day for several months. The group taking the resistant starch showed a measurable drop in the amount of fat stored in their liver, along with improvements in their liver enzyme levels. What struck me most was that much of this improvement happened without any significant weight loss. The researchers pointed to changes in gut bacteria as the likely explanation, the gut and the liver essentially talking to each other through a pathway researchers call the gut-liver axis. And separately, other trials have found that consistent resistant starch intake over several weeks meaningfully reduced visceral fat as well, the same deep abdominal fat my own doctor had flagged as a concern. Once I understood the mechanism, the rest made a lot more sense to me. When you eat refined starch, white bread, white rice, regular pasta, ordinary potatoes cooked and eaten straight away, it's been stripped of much of its natural structure, so it breaks down almost instantly into glucose. Your blood sugar spikes, and your body releases a large surge of insulin to bring it back down. Insulin is a storage hormone, and one of the things it tells your body to do is store fat, including in the liver and around the organs. Resistant starch does close to the opposite. It barely raises blood sugar at all. It requires far less insulin, and it sends fuel to your gut bacteria instead of your fat stores. Now, I know the cleanest way to avoid carbohydrate-related blood sugar spikes altogether would be to cut carbohydrates out completely, the way some people do on a strict ketogenic approach. At 65, I've tried enough diets in my life to know that anything too extreme rarely lasts. What I've settled on instead, and what actually seemed to move the needle for my liver, is much simpler. I eat carbohydrates less often than I used to, and when I do eat them, I try to make sure they're resistant starches rather than refined ones. When you build a meal around a resistant starch with plenty of vegetables, something with a bit of crunch, a good source of protein, and some healthy fat, you turn what could have been a blood sugar spike into a properly balanced plate that treats your gut well instead of stressing it. And if I go for a short walk afterward, even just around the block, my muscles help mop up the glucose from the meal before it can cause much trouble at all. That's really the whole philosophy behind how I eat now. If I'm going to have carbohydrates, make them the resistant kind. Here's the part that I think is the most useful, and the part that changed how I actually eat day to day, because you can create resistant starch yourself, right in your own kitchen, using foods you're probably already buying. When you cook starchy foods like potatoes, rice, or pasta, and then cool them down in the fridge, some of that digestible starch actually recrystallizes into resistant starch through a process called retrogradation. So a cold potato salad or rice that's been cooked and chilled overnight contains meaningfully more resistant starch than the same food eaten hot, straight off the stove. It's not going to match whole grains like quinoa or bulgur wheat for overall nutrition, but it's a genuinely useful shift for very little effort. The same trick works with bread, which is honestly the change I noticed the biggest personal difference from. Freezing bread and then toasting it straight from frozen has been shown in a number of studies to lower the blood sugar response compared with eating the same bread fresh. The freezing and toasting process changes the structure of the starch in a similar way to the cooling process with rice and potatoes. In our house now, whenever we bring home a proper seeded sourdough loaf, we slice it up straight away and put it in the freezer. Whenever we want toast, it comes straight from frozen into the toaster. I actually wore a continuous glucose monitor for a month last year out of curiosity, and my blood sugar response to frozen and toasted bread was noticeably lower and flatter than my response to the same bread eaten fresh on the day it was baked. So a few simple habits: batch cooking rice or potatoes and keeping the leftovers in the fridge, slicing and freezing a good loaf of bread as soon as you buy it. These turn everyday staples most of us already eat into something that works in favor of your gut and your liver rather than against them. I'm not doing this at every single meal, and I don't think you need to either. But on the days when I do have carbohydrates, trying to get them from these resistant forms has made a real measurable difference for me. Beyond the kitchen tricks, There are also foods that come naturally loaded with resistant starch without any preparation at all, and these have become staples in my own diet over the past year and a half. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas are among the very best sources, and I think that's a big part of why so many of the longest living populations around the world eat these foods so regularly. Slightly underripe green bananas are also rich in resistant starch, and they lose much of it as they ripen and become sweeter. Properly intact whole grains like oats and barley contain it naturally as well, and oats prepared the night before as overnight oats and eaten cold actually retain more resistant starch than oats cooked and eaten hot the same morning. Cashews are another food that carries a bit more resistant starch than people realize. None of these require a powder, a supplement, or anything from a health food shop, just a shift in which forms of these everyday foods you reach for. Which brings me back to that 40-gram figure from the research, because I think it deserves a fair bit of context. In the clinical trials, participants were given a measured powder, largely because that makes it much easier for researchers to track exact intake in a study, but I don't think the lesson here is to obsess over hitting a precise number every day. The real lesson, the one that actually changed how I eat, is that resistant starch behaves very differently in the body than ordinary refined starch. And if you're going to be eating carbohydrates at all, the resistant version is consistently the better choice for your liver, your waistline, and your long-term metabolic health. So if I were to sum up what actually shifted things for me at 65, it would be this. First, I reduced how often I eat carbohydrates overall, because I know those spikes in blood sugar are hard on the liver over time. Second, when I do eat them, I try to source them from whole, naturally resistant foods like beans, lentils, and chickpeas, or from the cooled and reheated versions of rice, potatoes, and bread that I described. None of this has felt like deprivation. It's felt more like a small, sustainable adjustment that stayed with me, because it doesn't ask too much of me on any given day. I want to be honest with you. This one change wasn't the only thing I did over the past 18 months. I moved a bit more, I paid more attention to my evening meals, and I cut back on the sugary snacks that used to be part of my daily routine without me even noticing. But when my doctor and I looked back at what shifted my liver scan the most, this change, swapping refined carbohydrates for resistant ones wherever I reasonably could, stood out as the one that made the difference feel almost effortless rather than like another rule I had to follow. At the end of the day, so much of what drives the health problems we worry about as we get older, the heart issues, the diabetes risk, even some of the cognitive decline that gets talked about so much these days, comes back to how often and how sharply our blood sugar spikes over the course of a normal week. Reducing how much refined carbohydrate I eat and being more deliberate about getting my carbohydrates from resistant sources when I do eat them has been one of the simplest, least dramatic changes I've made, and one of the ones that's paid off the most. I think it's worth walking you through what an actual day of eating looks like for me now, because I know it's one thing to talk about resistant starch in the abstract, and another thing entirely to see how it fits into real meals that a 65-year-old with a normal life actually eats. In the morning, I'll usually have overnight oats that I prepared the evening before, oats soaked in a bit of milk or yogurt in the fridge overnight, sometimes with a spoon of chia seeds and some berries on top. That's already two things working in my favor before I've even sat down to eat. The oats themselves contain resistant starch naturally, and preparing them the night before and eating them cold increases that further. On the days I want toast instead, it comes from a slice pulled straight from the freezer, toasted from frozen rather than defrosted first, which keeps that blood sugar response flatter than fresh bread ever gave me. For lunch, I lean heavily on beans, lentils, and chickpeas now in a way I never used to. A simple chickpea and vegetable salad with olive oil, some crunchy cucumber and pepper, and a boiled egg or a bit of feta for protein has become something close to a daily habit. If I'm having rice with dinner, more often than not, it's rice I cooked the night before and kept in the fridge, then reheated properly the next day, rather than a fresh pot made right before the meal. The same goes for potatoes if we're having a potato salad or roasted potatoes that have been cooked, cooled, and then reheated. I know I'm getting more of that resistant starch benefit than I would from potatoes taken straight from the oven and onto the plate. Dinner is usually built around a protein, plenty of vegetables, and then whichever resistant starch fits that particular meal. Lentils in a stew, a small portion of the pre-cooked and cooled rice, or simply extra vegetables and beans without any grain at all. And afterward, weather permitting, I try to get outside for a short walk, even 15 or 20 minutes around the neighborhood. That habit alone, walking shortly after eating, has been shown to help the muscles take up glucose from the meal more efficiently, which means less of it lingers in the bloodstream, doing the kind of damage that eventually shows up on a liver scan or a blood test. I think it's worth spending a moment on why visceral fat and liver fat are treated so seriously by doctors, because when my own results came back, the language used made it clear this wasn't just about appearance or a number on a scale. Visceral fat doesn't just sit there passively the way fat under the skin does. It's metabolically active tissue, which means it behaves almost like an organ of its own, releasing inflammatory compounds directly into the bloodstream and interfering with how the rest of the body responds to insulin. Fat that accumulates inside the liver behaves in a similar way, gradually making the liver less efficient at regulating blood sugar and clearing out toxins, and over years, in the more severe cases, it can progress toward more serious liver disease. That's part of why my doctor treated my mild fatty liver diagnosis as something worth acting on immediately rather than simply monitoring and waiting. What struck me as I read more into this is that the gut and the liver are far more connected than I ever appreciated before my diagnosis. The compounds produced when gut bacteria ferment resistant starch, particularly butyrate, appear to travel through the bloodstream and directly influence how the liver manages fat storage and inflammation. It's not simply that eating less refined starch takes pressure off the liver, though that's certainly part of it. It's that resistant starch actively feeds a population of gut bacteria that seem to send protective signals to the liver itself. That's a very different mechanism than simply cutting calories or cutting carbohydrates altogether, and it's part of why the research results held up even in people who didn't lose significant weight. I also want to be honest about the things that didn't change dramatically, because I think it's easy to make a video like this sound like a miracle cure, and that's not what this was for me. I didn't lose a large amount of weight. My waistline came down slightly, but not dramatically. What changed most clearly based on my blood work and my follow-up scan was the internal picture. The fat inside my liver itself, and the markers my doctor tracks to monitor it. That matched what I'd read in the research, that this particular shift can improve the liver specifically, even in people who don't see a big change on the bathroom scale. For someone my age, where the number on the scale has stopped moving the way it did decades ago, no matter what I try, that was honestly a relief to hear, because it meant the effort was working on the part that actually mattered most for my long-term health. It's also worth talking about how long this actually took, because I know when people hear a result like mine, the natural question is whether it happened in a few weeks or took years of effort. Realistically, it was closer to 4 to 6 months before my doctor and I saw a real, measurable shift on my blood work and it took the better part of a year before my follow-up scan showed a clear improvement in the liver fat itself. I mention this because I don't want anyone watching this to try a version of what I did for 2 weeks, see no dramatic change, and assume it isn't working. The trials that showed the clearest results ran for several months at a time, and my own experience matched that timeline closely. This is a slow, steady shift rather than a quick fix, and I think that's actually one of the reasons it's held up for me, because it never felt like an intense short-term push that I'd eventually burn out on and abandon. One thing I gently push back on is the idea that you need to buy a special powder or supplement to get any of this benefit. I never did, and I don't think most people need to either. The research that used a measured powder did so because it's easier to control in a clinical trial, not because the powder itself is somehow superior to getting resistant starch from real food. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, slightly green bananas, oats prepared the night before, and rice, pasta, or potatoes that have been cooked and cooled all provide the same underlying compound, just wrapped up in food you're probably already comfortable cooking and eating. If you're around my age and you've had a similar conversation with your own doctor about your liver, I hope this gives you somewhere useful to start and something concrete to bring up at your own next appointment. It's worth asking your doctor directly about your own liver enzyme levels and whether a change like this might be appropriate for your specific situation, since everyone's starting point is a little different. This was a personal story more than a lecture, so I hope you found it useful and it gave you something to think about. Let me know in the comments whether you've heard of resistant starch before, whether you've already been eating some of these foods without realizing the reasoning behind them, or whether any of this is completely new to you. I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next one.